What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another ProGuides video. I'm Gank, and today we're talking about 3 things that junglers need to know. No matter the meta, jungle is always going to be one of the roles that has a super heavy influence on how games play out. It's just a lot of power when one player can literally win 3 lanes. So with jungle being so vital to your team controlling the early game, it's really important that you actually have a good understanding of what your job is and how to do it. I promise even if you play jungle for years, you definitely have things you can improve on, and there's a reason you're probably not challenger. Yet. Now, the first and most important thing that we're going to talk about is having awareness of the laners on both teams. Now, I can't emphasize this point enough, so many games are lost by junglers forcing fights that are easy to avoid. Now, this does not just mean looking at the minimap and seeing roughly where both laners are. It's so common for junglers to type, "Oh, I thought you could move first," to their laners after they int away the double buffs. You need to also be looking at who has the bigger wave, if and when that wave will crash, as well as the resource bars both players have. You may have a really hard winning jungle matchup, but if your mid laner is pinned under tower with 2 stacked crashed waves, it is not their job to leave the turret and come coin flip a 2v2. Or maybe your mid laner is able to shove in the wave, but again, you have to look at their resources as well. If they have low HP or they're completely out of mana, they won't be able to provide much more than an extra kill to the enemy team if you end up in a skirmish. And aside from the state of the lane, you also just need to have a general understanding on how certain champions work at different stages of the game. If you're in a volatile jungle matchup, like Lee Sin versus Xin Zhao, early game skirmishes around lanes that can actually fight early is crucial to winning. If you're fighting in the river near mid lane and you have an Annie or a Qiyana as your mid laner, there's a good chance you can win 2v2 fights due to the CC and burst damage that they provide. But if your mid laner is Malzahar, odds are you aren't winning anything until he has his ultimate. So it's not just enough to have the waves in a good spot and for your laners to have high health and mana. You also need to make sure that your laner actually makes a difference in fights if they can and do show up. So with all that in mind, it really helps out if you can actually understand how different laners work and how matchups play out. Now, obviously experience helps a lot, but it can be tough to understand everything on its own, so thankfully that's where we can help out. We already collected a lot of the top players on the ladder, and they reached those ranks for a reason, and they're ready to share everything that they know to help you do the same. Book a session now and learn to carry like a pro. But anyway, back to topic. Now, before we get into our next point, I do have one last thing to say about forcing bad fights. A lot of junglers think that getting double crabbed is just the end of the game, and I gotta tell you, never has been, never will be. Just because you lost 2 Scuttle Crabs does not mean that you've lost the game. The only thing that will lose you the game is tilting from something like that happening. And that is especially true in the current jungle. Since catch-up experience was added back to jungle camps, you really have to get out of that mindset of being behind on camps meaning you're losing the game. In fact, you're better off being behind an experience if it means that you're giving up jungle farm to gank your laners. With the way jungle is now, it's perfectly fine to be down a couple of levels, or even a few, since you just need to go to a single full clear to close the gap down to about a 1 level difference. So stop tilting yourself and your team by forcing stupid plays that actually do cost you the game, and instead focus on winning the game through your laners. Now, the second thing that you need to know as a jungler is which lanes to path to. I know that we talked about which lanes you should play around in the last point, but that was more about the laners being able to help you when it comes to skirmishing with and invading the enemy jungler. This point is specifically about which lanes you should gank for. But before we get onto the topic at hand, I'm curious how you decide which lanes to gank when you're jungling right now. Do you always play a specific lane? Do you play to get certain allies fed? Or do you just shut down certain enemies? Maybe you even have a duo partner and you only ever gank for them. Whatever it is, let me know in the comments down below before we get into the next point. When thinking about which lanes you should be ganking, there's 2 key things to keep in mind. The first of those is what your win conditions in each game are. I don't actually like using the term win condition because it feels like you're hard locking yourself into specific ways to win the game. And if you don't meet those conditions, well, then you lose. That's not always true, but that's the term that people use, so for the sake of this video, we will too. But just think of it more along the lines of win guidelines, so it sounds a bit more loose. Anyway, enough about the semantics. It's important to think about which lanes will have an impact later in the game if you get them ahead. Personally, I think the right player on any champ can carry a game, but you have to think about each champ's carrying potential from a subjective point of view. Let's take Tryndamere for example. A fed Tryndamere can be a complete nightmare to deal with and can easily be a solo win condition. If the enemy team has to send 2 or 3 champions to answer his split just to prevent him from knocking over their base, the rest of your team is free to make a play on the rest of the map. But if Trin is up against a specific hard counter, let's say Malphite, things change quite a bit. Even with a massive lead, Tryndamere can't do much to push Malphite around once he has items like Thornmail and Frozen Heart. In fact, Tryndamere actually ends up being the one getting bullied. So if you're giving up your bottom side jungle and your bot lane is being dove until they're out of the game, all so that Tryndamere can win a side lane for 10 minutes and then be hard outscaled, you're probably not going to win through that specific win condition. Now, something that you'll hear a lot of people complain about in solo queue is if you gank for a tank top lane when you have a hyper carry AD carry. I get that actual carries are a bit more of a win condition, again, not necessarily the biggest fan of that term, but tanks with the lead can be really impactful too. I've seen lots of games with an overly fed tank like Maokai or Sion be unstoppable behemoths in fights. Even if they can't completely one-shot you like a Riven, when a tank like that comes out of top lane 8-0, it's pretty much impossible to kill them, and they can easily take on your backline 1v3 and win. On top of being viable carries themselves, tanks are also just generally easier to gank for, and that brings us to the second key thing that you need to think about when deciding which lanes to gank, knowing which lanes are actually easy to pull off ganks in. Some games are completely no-brainers. Say you're playing Elise or Lee Sin, and you have solo laners with both burst damage and CC, like a Pantheon or an Annie. You know the ganks in those lanes are completely free, but everything won't always be super clear-cut. Looking back on the topic of win cons, most players would say that if you have a champ like Jinx or Vayne, you should be playing to get them fed, since they're hyper carries. But you also have to consider their supports. If you're ganking for a Thresh or Nautilus, that's easy enough. But a support like Yuumi or Soraka provides basically no CC, aside from their inconsistent slows, and that can be more trouble than it's worth to even try and gank for them. Not only are you wasting your time by visiting a hard-to-gank lane with little chance of actually getting a kill, but now the enemy jungler gets to invade your topside for free. And that's exactly why I almost always play around top lane tanks when I jungle. Not only is a fed tank a very reliable team fighter due to their CC and just how unkillable they are, but it's also just a good way to get myself into the game. Remember, as a jungler, you yourself have to be strong enough to win fights for your team early on. Jinx or Vayne can still be the carry in later fights, but you gotta play for yourself in the early game. So TLDR for this point, number 1, gank for lanes that are actually easy to gank for, generally those that have CC. And number 2, don't completely waste your time and resources on a champ that can be easily shut down by the enemy team. Now before we get on to the last point, I just want to say this. I know the junglers aren't the only ones that need to learn a thing or two about their role. Top laners need to stop getting waves throws on them, mid laners need to know when to follow a roam, AD carries need to know when to just give up farm, and some support players really need to learn how to make proactive plays. The list of dumb things that teammates do or fail to do right can go on forever. And that brings us to today's question of the day. What's your biggest pet peeve in League of Legends? As a support mid myself, one of my biggest pet peeves is when I go on a warding mission and my AD carry plays way too forward and then dies in a 1v2 situation. Especially if I ping that I'm leaving lane. But anyway, let me know yours in the comments down below. So the third and final thing that all junglers need to know is that not every play you make as a jungler has to be ganking to get a kill. Sometimes you're just ganking to show some presence. This can be to relieve pressure on your laners in bad matchups, or just to scare the enemy laners so that they're more cautious about moving up. Sometimes I even go for ganks that I know will not result in a kill 2 or 3 times in a row on the same lane just to pressure the enemy laner. Obviously, I don't just mindlessly do this all the time. I only do something like this right after a full clear when I know that there's no chance of the enemy jungler punishing me by taking camps away on the other side of the map. Another time that you gank when you know there's a low percentage of getting a kill is to just blow cooldowns on the enemy team. Specifically, you're hoping that you can get flashes off the enemy team's immobile and squishy champs that you'll then be targeting in the next team fight. And again, the reason that you want to do this is so that the enemy team has a harder time fighting for dragons, and so with that in mind, you also want to make sure that you're lining up your cooldowns with those spawn timers as well. What I mean by that is that if you're going to use your Jarvan ultimate to get the enemy Orianna's flash, you should be doing that 2 full minutes before the dragon spawns. That way, your ult is up again in time for the dragon fight itself, while the Orianna doesn't have flash. It doesn't do any good to blow Ori's flash 1 minute before dragon spawns, because then you'll have to play that fight without your most important cooldown. And lastly for this point, sometimes the plays that you should be going for aren't even ganks at all. Something that you see a lot in high elo but almost never in lower elos is junglers helping their laners push in waves. And I don't just mean after ganking. Good junglers know that they sometimes have to leave their jungle with no intention of even going for a gank. They simply just walk up to the wave, shove it in with their teammate, and give them a chance to go back for a reset. This is always a good thing to do, but it's especially important to make sure that your laners are able to get off a reset before a big teamfight objective. Just make sure that when you do this, your laners know what you're doing and are okay with it. Like I said, this is common in higher elos, but in lower ones, players may mistake you for taxing their wave, and as a result become tilted or just run it down. Oh, and with that, make sure that you're not actually taxing their wave and letting them last hit instead. And that wraps up things for the 3 things that all junglers need to know. Really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to sub so you never miss out on any of our other content just like this. Also, don't forget to answer our question of the day in the comments below. Oh, and one last thing, don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box below where you can discuss League further or just hang out and be part of the community. Can't wait to see you back in the next video, but until then, best of luck on the Rift, stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time.